Hi, I'm the family photographer, and in this episode I'm going to be showing you the computer that I use here in front of me for photo editing and why I think it and computers like it are a good budget option for getting the job done at home. Welcome back. Before we get underway, if you'd like to learn how to take quality family photos and to shoot like a professional, then please consider subscribing to this channel where I'll share my journey and help you with yours. Why am I making this video? The reason is because you don't have to have the latest and greatest computer hardware. There's a lot of information out there that's sort of suggesting that you need to have the latest Ryzen chip or high-end 10th generation Intel chip to get involved in photo editing or video editing, and I just don't think that's true. Certainly there are times when it helps to have the hardware, but we can't always afford that, and I don't believe you need the latest and greatest computer hardware to get involved in the kind of stuff like taking quality family photos for your children, and I'm going to prove it to you. I'm also making this video because we're not all professionals, so again, we don't have income coming in necessarily to support our hobbies or interests or this important work of documenting and taking artistic photos of your children. If you're a professional and you've got money coming in from your clients, then of course it's just a business transaction. You go get the latest computer hardware, you get the latest camera gear, and that's fine, but we don't always have that privilege. And the other reason I'm making this video is because if I can edit quality family photos on the computer I have in front of me, which I'll tell you about soon, then you can too. A bit about my background. I have an undergraduate degree in computers. I've been around computers all my life. I've loved them. I've followed the hardware journey, the software journey throughout my life, so I kind of get them. I don't claim to know everything, but I know enough to comment, I think, on why I think a humble computer like mine is actually good enough. What I'm not covering in this episode is just the extra stuff like monitors and other peripherals. I'm also not covering all the options available to us in the budget realm of different types of computers that you could get. I'm just covering the computer that I've got and using that as a bit of a use case, saying anything sort of in that vicinity, anything in that sort of generation is probably going to have similar results. Okay, so what computer am I using? I'm using a Dell 9020 small form factor workstation. These workstations are used in offices, in schools and universities. They're produced en masse, and they're not designed to be high-end, but gee whiz, they pack a punch. And I bought this secondhand. I did not buy new. It is not about the latest and greatest. It's about something that's really good at a really good price. So I bought a Core i7 version of this, the 4790. It's got a 3.6 gigahertz base clock with a boost of 4, and that CPU was manufactured in 2014, so that's roughly the age then of my computer, right? So it's 6 years old. And I bought this in 2020 because I knew that this was good enough. I came with 16 gigabytes of RAM. I added an M2 drive, a fast M2 drive that I use to store my photos that I'm currently editing, and then I dish them off to my server when I'm done. I've also a fast SSD boot disk, so I added a few things to make it work well for fast disk access. But at the end of the day, it's an office workstation and it does the job really well. So it's a humble computer. I haven't gone all out, not even close, but it's good enough. And as I dived into the data behind this, you'll see that it actually really is good enough. And if I can get away with a computer like this, then there's every chance that you can get away with a computer that you currently have, or you could go ahead and buy a secondhand something like this and be quite happy for the purpose of editing photos. Okay, let's talk about why I bought this computer. I mean, why would I buy an office type computer that's not even in a big case? I can't easily overclock it. Well, the reason is I couldn't afford a brand new computer, and it's the thing I could afford at the time. We were doing a computer reshuffle. I thought, oh, I'll just get another one of those boxes. They're really easy, single box swap, and I pretty much got everything I needed. A fast i7, 16 gigabytes of RAM. I threw in the components I already had, my fast M2, my fast boot disk, and then it's a pretty decent computer. So, why did I buy it? Well, it was convenient and it was cheap. So I spent 300 Australian dollars on this box. That's about 210 at the moment, US dollars if you're living in the States. And so it's basically next to nothing, but what you get is really good. It also comes pre-registered for Windows 10. So when they were selling them, it was Windows 8 at the time, so it's got a Windows 8 license. You get an automatic upgrade to Windows 10. So even if I was to just buy Windows itself, I'm probably 100, 150 bucks out of pocket. So I get Windows, I get fairly decent RAM size, fairly fast CPU for next to nothing. That's why I bought this computer, and I can use it for photo editing, and I think you could do something similar as well. Why do I know that this computer is good for photo editing? Well, I know from experience that it can get the job done. I've used it now for quite some time. It's fast enough. In fact, it's quite fast. I don't even build previews in Lightroom. I just do minimal previews, and it loads really quite fast when you have that fast M2 drive in there. I'm dealing with a 24 megapixel camera. I think if you're dealing with like a high-end 45, 46, 50 megapixel camera, you might need something faster, not sure. But it gets the job done, I think, for most photo editing purposes. Here's what you need to know. The broad context of computers today is different to how it was in the past. At the moment, there's incremental updates all the time, and computers are getting incrementally faster, but it's not evolutions, it's not in leaps and bounds, it's little bit and little bit and little bit. There was a thing in the past called Moore's Law. A man by the name of Gordon Moore, who co-founded Intel a very long time ago, he observed that the computing power of computers, the way they could pack in more transistors inside a CPU and make them smaller and smaller, therefore faster and faster, meant that computers' speed doubled every 2 years. First it was every year, then he said, it's every 2 years. And now I believe, and others have said, that this thing called Moore's Law, that they double every 2 years, that was the rate of increase, it's dead. That concept is over. So what that means is that old computers that you have are not that far behind the new computers that are coming out now. So my computer, this Dell 9020, it's so old, 6 years old today, is by now, according to the old standard, new computers should be 3 times faster than this baby, but they're not. They're half that. And I'm going to get onto the facts and figures soon. But Moore's Law as a concept, the notion that computers just get exponentially faster and faster and faster, it's over. That's not true. An example of this is NVIDIA's CEO, Jensen Huang, has said that Moore's Law used to grow 10 times every 5 years and 100 times every 10 years. But right now, Moore's Law is growing a few percent every year. Every 10 years, maybe it doubles. It's in 2s. So Moore's Law, he said, is finished. So this is big. This is huge news. And it means that your old computer can do more than your old computer in the past used to be able to do. The other broad concept that's worth exploring, just in terms of the general usage of your computer for other purposes, even outside photo editing, is that an old computer now is probably going to do a decent job, especially if you've got a fast, boot disk and a fast RAM, a lot of RAM, because Windows 10 has been around for a while. So I guess I'm speaking from a PC point of view. No disrespect to Macs, I've used them for years, love them too. But as just an example, Windows 10 was released in July 2015, so not long after my CPU, And even at the time, it was based on the same specs as Windows 8.1, and that may have been based on the specs of Windows 7, not sure, but in terms of like the minimum specifications of what you were required to have, you only needed to have a 1 gigahertz computer and a 1 gigabyte of RAM. So, you know, these days, you know, how do you find a CPU under 3 gigahertz? And you wouldn't find a computer being sold for less than 4 gigabytes of RAM. So just in terms of general usage, your computer, an old computer, can probably get the job done with the operating system, and you'll find general browsing, general moving around is quite fast. The other broader context that's worth exploring is relating to Adobe. So I use Adobe Lightroom for my photo editing. It's one of the industry standards of photo editing. There is, you know, Capture One and other packages as well, but you know, I feel that Lightroom is probably the predominant thing. You need to know that Adobe historically has favored something called single core processing speed. So again, this relates to Moore's law. When they realized they couldn't get faster speeds by making things smaller anymore, they decided they would package multiple CPUs into one CPU, and this is called multi-core processing. So, but Adobe though, when they're building their software, historically they've really just used one single core, and the single core speed, the speed at which one single core operates, has been the defining factor for performance. So that means even though newer processors have, you know, 4 cores, 8 cores, 12 cores, 16 cores, or even 32 cores, it means that really they're not performing much faster in the Adobe Creative suites. Now, there's been advancements in this recently. You know, Adobe has got a whole lot better with how they're handling this, but still, in my opinion, the single core speed of a processor for Adobe products is far more important than its multi-core capability. And doing a bit of digging around and reading between the lines, can't be sure, not a Lightroom engineer. The multi-core aspects, say, of Lightroom only apply, for example, if you have 12 gigabytes of RAM, and happens for things like import and export and HDR images and panoramas, you know, additional things that you might sometimes use. But for general browsing through photos and basic editing that you may do, the single core processing speed is king. No doubt this is because, and this again, technical alert, you know, the coders are probably using underlying APIs in terms of displaying a photo or doing adjustments to photos, and those, depending how those underlying procedures and APIs that they're utilizing are coded and using, you know, they're probably not using, you know, they're probably not breaking that down into sizable chunks that can pass through multiple processors or multiple cores within a CPU. So the single core speed is still king. So this is the broad context. The broad context in all of this is computers are nowhere near as fast as they used to be. They're not moving forward as fast as they used to be. Windows 10, if that's your operating system, has to be if you're using Adobe, you know, is going to run pretty swimming, going to run pretty well on an old computer. And Adobe, even though people are building multi-core processors, the single core speed is still really, really important. So let's dive in then and look at some of the numbers. Now, I've only got this humble thing, a 9020, and you know, you think it wouldn't do very well, but it actually does really well. I spent, have I said this yet? I've spent 300 Australian dollars on this. So you might be viewing this from the US, that's about 210 US dollars. It's basically nothing. And I got a whole computer minus, you know, the peripherals and the monitors and stuff, and it does okay. So let's look at the numbers. Remember that single core speed is the most important. Looking at something like Geekbench browser, you know, if I went to the top of the list and went, what was the fastest single core CPUs you could get today, brand new, it's the Intel Core i9 10900K, which has a base clock of 3.7 gigahertz. Do you get this? It's only pretty much the same base clock as mine, It has 10 cores, which again, we may not need all these cores. And the single core processing speed that it gets, the score that it gets on Geekbench browser, maybe there's other benchmarks, but this is just one, gets a score of 1419. My CPU gets a single core processor score of 942. So it's definitely faster than mine, but not exponentially, not by multitude factors, not even close. So that's really curious. So the architecture inside that CPU is making it go faster. There's no doubt that's faster, but let's look at the value that you get. That CPU, the i9-10900K, costs, in Australian dollars, about $1,200. In US, it's about $850. Do you get this? The CPU is running 1.5 times faster than mine. It's faster, I admit it, but it costs 8 times more. So do you see where I'm coming from? Like the value of my CPU and the processor that I have and that you might have, that you might be running, or you could go ahead and get quite easily secondhand, it's ginormous. The other way of looking at it is my CPU costs 1/8 of the price, and it's 2/3 of the speed of the fastest CPU in relation to the single core processing speed that you could get today. So this is huge, and I hope this is really encouraging for you with the CPU or the computer that you have right now. You might be able to use it for making quality family photos or whatever you want to use it for, but it's probably doing much better than you might imagine. And let's look at the moment at the numbers in relation to multi-core processing. So again, I don't believe that Adobe is making use of the multi-core processing that it could be in all circumstances, but it does in some circumstances. Let's look at this for the sake of it. If you were to obtain the fastest multi-core CPU at the moment, again, this is by Geekbench browser. There's probably other sources that would come at different conclusions, but according to Geekbench browser, this is the fastest multi-core CPU at the moment is the AMD Ryzen Threadripper 3900X. This has 64 cores, so obviously you would buy this if you're a corporation and you had a particular purpose for 64 cores. It has a multi-core score of 24,026. It costs thousands of dollars. So in Australian dollars, this is $7,500. In US, it's like just over $5,000. My CPU that I get for next to nothing has a score of, close to 3,500. So admittedly, this CPU, the Threadripper 3900X, is 7 times faster than my CPU. So my computer is kicking it. But it costs thousands of dollars. Who's going to buy the CPU? It costs 50 times more. Now, in other way of looking at it, my CPU is 1/7 of the speed and 1/50th of the cost. So my CPU is doing okay, price to performance wise. And even if you don't think you can even buy that one. Like, I don't think anyone is really buying that 64 core CPU. It's hard to even find someone who can distribute that to you. But if you look at something like the Ryzen 3950X, which is a 16 core beast, I would love to have it, absolutely. It scores on Geekbench browser 14,000 something. It costs 1,300 Australian, 920 USD. Well, my CPU, again, it only scores 3,400 on the Geekbench browser. So this CPU would be 4 times faster than mine, but it costs 8 times the amount. So do you see where I'm getting at? My CPU, yeah, it's not the latest and greatest, but it presents really good value for money. And as a family photographer, and as, again, someone who is not making money from what they do, but really wants the best, then you want the best value for money that you can get. And the best value for money that you can get at the moment, I think, would be going secondhand. Or buy new if you want, but just know that if you're buying new, that the difference you're getting is not in leaps and bounds like it used to be. It's a little bit more. So let's look at it from another angle at the moment. If you were looking to create something, make something, have something for use for taking family photos, for using that as a hobby and really diving deeper into doing the best you can with photos, then here are some essential upgrades that I would suggest. I definitely believe that you need a fast SSD for your operating system. So I have that. I have a Samsung Evo 850. I think you need a fast, bigger disk. I like to have a separate disk for where you dump all your photos that you're currently editing. So I've got forget like an ATA, a Data XPG something M2. And again, mine's quite small, so it's 512 gigabytes. And when my workflow, when I go through all my editing process, I dump that off onto my server. So I don't try to have the largest storage size on my computer, but you need something fast for what you're doing. And I would definitely recommend, in terms of, say, the essential upgrades that I'd recommend that you get or obtain if you don't already have it, or when you're buying something new. Get 16 gigabytes of RAM. I wouldn't run on anything less. It just helps the computer flow really well with anything that you're doing, especially if you're doing video work or photo work. And I find that the price of DDR3 compared to, say, DDR4 is huge. So again, getting like an old spec secondhand computer running DDR3, just max it out. On some motherboards with in that generation of CPU, 16 gigabytes is the highest, and some motherboards 32 gigabytes is the highest. If your motherboard can do 32, then do 32. My motherboard can do 32. I might upgrade it yet, but I would get an older computer and get 16 or 32 gigabytes of RAM rather than a new computer with less. Because some of those new computers that I'm seeing selling with 8 gigabytes of RAM, that's really crippling for a computer and really crippling for your photo editing. And so, in my opinion, the essential upgrades you need, are some fast disks basically, because you're dealing with some big data and you need to access that really quickly, and a lot of random access memory. So go get a lot of RAM, and if you haven't got these things, go get them. It'll really help. So I hope that gives you a bit of hope for the computer that you have. There's a phrase that takes place in the photography world in relation to camera gear, and they say that the best camera is the camera that you have with you, which is another way of saying that you can use your smartphone when you want to. But I think in relation to this stuff, the best photo editing computer that you could have is the computer that you have with you. It might be the one that you have right now. Go ahead and buy something secondhand if you like. Even just try running photo editing software on the computer that you do have. It might just do it. Check it out. See the speed that you're getting. See if you're content with that, if you're happy with that. And if you are, just live with that. We don't need the latest and greatest. You don't need the latest and greatest depending on your purposes. If you're a family photographer like me, if this is not your work, if this is not your profession, if you don't have a business that you can pour all this money into, and of course you want it the fastest and the best, then that's fine if that was you. But if that's not you, then just use what you have. Give it a try. Do those upgrades I suggested, and see where you end up. So I really hope that this video somewhat gives you hope, because it might mean that your current computer that you have can last a bit longer. You may not need an upgrade right now. You might consider buying secondhand when you never considered that before. And remember that the best computer that you have for photo editing is the one that you have already.